Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Devarshi?
Vanaik. Yeah, we can hear
Oh,
you.
oh, good, good. Because this is a new system. I've never done this before. This WebEx CV, but I can't see you, and I don't think you can see me. Can you? Hello,
Yeah, I'm trying to make myself visible.
and I'm trying to make myself visible. I'm not sure how to do that.
Rubul, oh, acha. Hmm. Professor Vanaik,
Yes,
there should be one option just at the bottom of the screen called video. Okay.
it says start video.
Yeah, yeah. You have to click
I
there.
pressed that already, but I pressed
No,
that already. Nothing. It was open here, but
can,
connecting to video services it says, but nothing is there. Nothing is happening.
okay. When I click that, they showed, do you want to allow the camera? Then I said yes. And now you can see me, right? In your
No, I
screen?
can't.
Oh, you
I
cannot see
can't see.
me.
No.
Acha.
Should I go back and just enter again with that panel at one two
Yeah,
three? Huh?
yeah, but I think otherwise you are there. I mean, I can see your name and all that.
Yeah,
But
but I can't see you. I can't see anything here. Start video. Should I press this share? No.
my panel member. So
This is not
he's
a.
saying that he cannot see me.
I can't see you.
Yeah. So, Professor, if you can log out maybe and try to log in.
I'll do that again.
Yeah.
Then should I switch off?
I think you need to log out from there,
Yes, then I better.
right?
Oh, but then how do I log? It says here log out. But that X, there's a big black X. Maybe I have to press that, huh?
Yeah, yeah, this one, red one.
Right one. I'm pressing that, but wait, let me just see that. Yeah, let me press this one. I'm pressing that. Nothing is happening so far.
Okay.
I, okay, whole HOS. Tom Mitchell is there, but I can't see anything.
Yeah. Hello. Hello,
Leave.
Professor.
It says leave webinar. I'll do that again. Huh? And then I'll come back. No, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
happening. It's
yeah.
not happening. I'm not able to leave.
So, Professor Vinayak, what you can do is just to cancel the Windows itself, the window itself.
I'm doing that.
Okay,
Leave. I'll
then
just leave. And
Professor Michael, how are you? We cannot hear you. I think you have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
You hear me now?
Yeah, yeah. Now it's fine.
Yeah, I had it muted, and it's I'm not it's I'm used to Zoom, and you hit the mute button on Zoom, and it unmutes, and
Right.
this has a couple extra step.
Yeah, yeah. That's extra step is there. So there is another panel member of ours who is Professor Vanaik, Achin Vanaik, and he was there and he was not able to hear us and we were not able to see him. So he has logged out and he'll try to come back.
Okay, and then there's another panelist, right?
Yeah, Dipankar Basu. Professor Vanaik, can you hear us now?
I can hear you. I can't see anybody.
Oh, you cannot see us.
No. I asked for my. Yeah, I don't know. I just see three things here: HODHSS host, your
Right.
name, Devarshi, and then below that, two boxes, and the third box at the bottom, Tom Mitchell.
Yeah,
and that's it.
Tom Michael has
Michael,
joined us,
Tom Michael, but I cannot see anybody. And
and you cannot see the faces of ours also, no?
no,
Okay. So
but at least if you can hear me, then I can of course read it out. I don't know, but I can't see anything else. I don't know what's happening. You didn't
Did
do
you log
Zoom.
in
You've
as a
done this thing
panelist?
which I
sorry.
joined from my browser. I didn't.
Yeah, we also joined through our browser,
Hmm.
and I can see Professor Michael there.
No, I can't see anybody.
I joined through the WebEx. I downloaded the WebEx and joined through that.
Yeah, I
Um,
couldn't download the WebEx. They said you haven't been not able to
did
do so.
you did you log in as a panelist?
Yes,
Okay, so that's
I joined from the browser and I logged in as a panelist, and I've got these three boxes, but no pictures. At least I can hear.
Professor Michael, Professor Vanak, you can hear Professor Michael, right?
I can hear Professor Michael as
Okay.
well.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. So the main problem is that we cannot see you and you cannot see us. That is the
that's
main.
right.
Yeah.
That's
Um, my assistant tells me that one way to resolve this could be if you have the um, app app of WebEx,
I
then
don't
it
have
oh, you don't have that.
because
Okay,
when
let
I
us
did try, they asked me to download it all, and I don't
right.
have that.
What else can is possible? Let me ask him once again. If I'll seek your indulgence for a minute.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked to my technical assistant. He says that it's a problem of compatibility of the system with maybe the this particular uh,
There is these three
WebEx.
dots, and I've tried here. It says video system connect to video system. Should I press that or not?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
No, connected to a device. No video systems address. Enter a video address. What do I do about enter a video address?
So I was wondering, Professor Vinayak, if it is not resolved,
Hmm.
then shall we go on like this? You not able to see us and we
I can
not
at
able to
least,
see
yeah,
you.
I've written what I have to say, so I can read that out. It'll take about 7, 8
Okay,
minutes. That's not a problem.
okay,
So, I mean, at least as long as the sound is there and you can hear me,
right,
that's about all I can do. But
right.
so then I just call in from a video system, enter a video address.
Hmm.
None of this. I can't do anything here.
Yeah, so we go without the picture for you.
Okay.
Your name is visible, so people will be able to understand who is speaking.
Okay. Because I cannot see the box with my name on it, but then I'm not supposed to actually. I can see just the three.
Yeah.
HODHSS. I think Amit Basole has not yet joined, has he?
No, I think he has not joined. Let me call him up and try to find out.
Hmm. I'd asked you. I sent you my telephone number also,
Yes,
just in the
yes,
latest email.
yes, I've got that. Thank you. Okay, Dipankar has joined us. The Hello, Dipankar.
Hi, hi Tom.
Yeah.
Hi, Dipankar.
So we are waiting for Amit. I'll call him up, try to call him up and try to fix the format.
Okay,
Professor Vinayak, Dipankar has joined us. Professor Vinayak is having some problem with the video. So we cannot see him and he cannot see us. But
oh,
otherwise, he can hear us and we can hear him.
okay. Hi Achin.
So I just talked to Amit. Amit is reaching his home in 5 minutes.
Okay,
So we shall wait for him. If by 7 he's not there, we shall start anyway.
okay,
And then if he joins us, then we'll continue. So I
okay.
just wanted to fix the format. Professor Vanayak, you can hear us? Okay, so format is what I thought initially is that first Dipankar will speak about the book for about 20 minutes after I have introduced the speakers. And after that, the panelists will make their comments. If they have any questions, they can ask. And that will take around 30 minutes max. So after that, Dipankar may like to, you know, respond to those comments. And finally, we'll open it for the audience. This is being telecast live on YouTube. So people might ask questions on the YouTube channel also. So we'll take those questions, and people might join in the WebEx Cisco also. And finally, there will be concluding remarks, and that's it. So I hope it will be about a matter of 1 hour, maybe 10 minutes more.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good.
Tom, are you okay with that?
Yes.
Okay.
So Achin, can you hear us?
Let him let him try to call him up and try to find out.
Okay,
Okay, I just had a talk with Professor Achin Vinayak, and he's saying that he right now when he's talking, we are not able to hear him. So I asked him to log out and try to log in once more and try to see if it improves or not.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, he has disappeared from the screen. So maybe he's trying to log back in.
Hmm.
I don't know what I just did.
What?
Uh-oh.
So
Oh, there I am. I'm
so
sorry, I
let us.
accidentally hit a button and I think I logged myself out and I thought I
No,
logged
Tom.
myself out.
Well, Tom, you're there. We can hear you and see you.
Yes, that's terrific.
So let us wait for a few minutes more.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amit is there. Yeah, Amit is there. Hello, Amit.
Hi, Amit.
I am
You're
in.
muted.
Sorry. I'm sorry for my lateness. Hello, everyone.
No, you're not late.
So Professor Vanaik tried to join, but there was a problem with the video. We could we could not see him. We could hear what he was saying. So he has logged out and yeah, Professor Vinayak has come back. Yeah, Professor Vinayak, can you say something?
Hello, I'm Achin
Yeah, yeah,
Vinay.
yeah, yeah.
I hope you can hear me, Moment.
Yes. we
I
can hear
can't
you.
see anybody, but at least I can hear everybody. Huh?
Okay.
Video problem is still there. Audio
Yes,
wise, we are fine.
I
Okay.
hope it remains so. Perhaps you should start with me first, in case while it's still working, I don't know.
That's a good idea. Yeah. So let us start. I think we are already 3 minutes late. Um, so welcome everyone. Good morning to the audience and the participants from US, and good evening to us who are joining from India. So here we are gathered to discuss a book which has come out recently. So in the US, it came out in the last year, I think in November, and in India, it became available from this year itself, from January this year. The name of the book is The Logic of Capital. Professor Dipankar Basu, who teaches economics at the Department of Economics, University of Massachusetts Amherst, he has written this book. Uh, I'm not going to say more about this book because we are going to find that out from the panelists. And with Dipankar Basu, we have Professor Amit Basole, Professor Tom Michael, and Professor Achin Vanaik. So I'll just add a few words about their, introduction. Um, Dipankar specializes in classical political economy of development with a focus on India, and applied uh, econometrics. Amit, he teaches economics at the Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. He specializes in labor, artisanal economics, structural change in employment, and he heads the Center for Sustainable Employment in Azim Premji University. Thomas Michael is an emeritus professor of economics at the Colgate University, USA. Macroeconomics and political economy are among his research interests. Professor Michael has contributed numerous journal articles and books. He is an author of the classic text Growth and Distribution, which he has written with Duncan Foley. Professor Achin Vinayak is a retired professor of international relations Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Professor Vanaik has authored, edited, and contributed to many books ranging from the studies of India's political economy, religion, communalism, as well as international contemporary politics and nuclear disarmament. So, today is a special day in the sense that, uh, in fact, there are two occasions which have coincided on this day. First is today is International Mother Language Day. So exactly 70 years ago, on 21st of February 1952, uh, Pakistani army shot down many protesters in Dhaka, the streets of Dhaka, and that movement ultimately led to the formation of Bangladesh in 1971. So this day is commemorated as the International Mother Language Day because those protesters were, protesting against the imposition of Urdu on East Bengal. And secondly, in 1848, on this day, Communist Manifesto was published. So we are on an auspicious, occasion, and it's a good time to talk about Marx. So I hand it over to Dipankar. He will take around 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Devarshi. So I'll share my screen. I have some slides. Okay, so I hope it is visible. Is it visible? Okay. Okay, so thanks to Devarshi and the Department of HSS at IIT Guwahati for sharing, organizing this book talk. And I'm very happy to be on this panel to hear what other panelists have to say about the book and to answer any questions that might come from panelists and participants. So I will get started right away and talk briefly about the structure of the book, and then I will point out to some novel arguments which I have tried to develop in the book. And then I will end with two things. I will talk about some research questions that come out of this exploration for future research. And finally, I will talk a little bit about a companion website of the book where you can go to find data used in the book, typological errors, errata, etc. So the book is divided into two parts. It is primarily meant to be an introduction to the logic of capital as laid out in the 3 volumes of Capital written by Marx. So the book is divided into two parts. The first part is really an elaboration of the argument as I understand it in the 3 volumes of Capital. So this first part has 4 chapters. In chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. In chapter 2, I discuss some methodological issues to get the scene set up for the discussion. And then chapter 3, 4, 5, and 3, 4, and 5 then discuss the 3 volumes of Capital, one chapter devoted to each volume. And then the second part of the book, after we have finished understanding the basic argument laid out by Marx in the 3 volumes, I take up 3 important issues which have been issues of debate, discussion, controversy for the last several decades. And I devote each chapter to each of those issues. One of them relates to the issue of technical change and profitability, one very important issue in Marxist economics. The second relates to the relationship between values and prices, again, an issue that has generated a lot of controversy and discussion. And finally, the last chapter discusses the relationship between exploitation and oppression. So let me give a quick overview of each of the chapters. So in chapter 2, I discuss 3 important issues. One, I wanted readers to understand why it is that Marx came to the study of economics, because he was trained as a philosopher. So what led him to the lifelong study of economics? I thought this was important to know because a lot of what he did from 1848 onwards can be understood once we understand why he came to the study of economics. And the simple reason is that after he finished studying philosophy, he did not get a job because he was a radical activist, and he started working as a journalist. When he was working as a journalist, he came to face issues of what he called material interest, and in his debates with others, he suddenly realized that he did not have the background and training to understand and engage in debates of material issues. And that is what led him to the study of economics. The importance of material issues and the material life of common people was the focus of his economics. And that's what actually led him and kept him in the study of economics. So from there, then we talk about important methodological issues which has been discussed again a lot. One is the dialectical method, which he takes from Hegel, but also changes it. And then his understanding, unique understanding of historical change, which he shared with his colleague, Friedrich Engels, which actually animated a large part of the Communist Manifesto, which Debashi told us was published today in 1848. And finally, I talk a little bit about the structure of the volumes of Capital. So there is a logic to why Marx presented his analysis in 3 volumes and how they're related to each other. So it's important to actually know that, because many methodological and substantive issues otherwise get misunderstood. So broadly, Marx, after he had finished his researches, wanted to present his study at 2 different levels of abstraction. First is what we call capital in general, where the primary relationship that he was studying was, on the one hand, capital as a block, and on the other hand, labor as a block, and the interrelationships between the two, the contradictory relationship. So volume 1 and 2 are pitched at this level of abstraction. What that means is that he abstracted from 2 important issues, which he then brought into the analysis when he moved to the next level of abstraction, which is many capitals. And volume 3 of Capital is pitched at that level. Many capital brings in 2 things: the competitive process between the capitals, and second, the presence of credit relations. So those are the 2 things that he brings into the analysis in volume 3. Now, for Marx, the notion of surplus value was a key and perhaps the most important concept to understand capital. And if we agree with that, then we can also see that volume 1 is about how surplus value is generated and what is done with it once it is generated. So generation and accumulation of surplus value. Volume 2 is about the realization of surplus value with the sale of commodities. And volume 3 is about the distribution of surplus value through various channels, and then showing up as the income streams of the non-working people in capitalist society. So that's how we can relate all the 3 volumes. And using the concept of surplus value, we can see how the logic flows from generation to realization and then to distribution. So when we come to the next chapter, chapter 3 of the book, where I discuss the logic of volume 1, I basically follow the logic of the argument as laid out by Marx. So I start with the commodity. From there, I come to the concept of value. Once the concept of value is there, it automatically leads to the concept of money, which then allows us to understand the notion of capital and its relationship to surplus value. And then I pause a little and spend some time understanding this important and unique commodity called labor power, which is at the center of surplus value generation. And here I engage with and draw on some recent scholarship in the Marxist feminist tradition, which has allowed us to understand the production of this commodity much better. So this is important, and I spend some time understanding that. Then I look at the general accumulation of capital. So once surplus value is generated, that is plowed back into the production process, and that's what Marx calls accumulation of capital. And then that leads to the question of the reserve army of labor, which is an important issue because if we follow this analysis, we can understand that capitalist societies have a large pool of unemployed and unemployable labor, not as a matter of accident, but as a matter of necessity. And that logic comes out very easily as we follow Marx through chapter 1. So at the end of chapter 25, where we have finished the generation of surplus values discussion, the main logic of volume 1 has been posed, it has been explained. And then Marx asked the question as to how a system which is governed by the generation and accumulation of surplus value, how that came to the fore, how that was historically created. And in the last part of volume 1, Marx answers this question specifically for the case of England using the concept of primary accumulation of capital. So I discussed that concept in detail in the last part of chapter 3. So with that, we finish the argument in volume 1, and then we move to volume 2, which is discussed in chapter 4. Now, the link between volume 1 and volume 2 is that when Marx was discussing the generation and accumulation of surplus value, he ignored questions of demand, meaning he ignored the question, how do the commodities get sold so that all their value is realized? And that is the question of realization of value or realization of surplus value. And Marx poses that question in volume 2 of Capital, and we discuss that in chapter 4 of the book. So there are a lot of uninteresting and kind of boring details related to the circulation process, which I quickly go over. And then I point out two analytical innovations that Marx brings about in discussing realization of surplus value. One is the circuit of capital, which we had seen earlier in the previous chapter, but which now Marx discusses in much more detail, which kind of captures the temporal flow of value as the capitalist economy moves over time. So I discuss that briefly and then point to a literature which has looked at this issue in great detail. And the other issue, the other analytical construct that Marx brings in here is to ask what is the correct use value mix of production, meaning when the capitalist comes back to the market with the money that he has to purchase means of production and labor power, how does the capitalist system ensure that means of production and means of consumption is available in the correct proportion that is needed by the smooth reproduction of the system? So this question Marx posed very clearly, and using the reproduction schemas gave a very important and transparent answer. This was an important analytical innovation which has remained with the discipline of economics even till today. So these are these various sectoral, two-sector, n-sector models which really derive from the reproduction schemas. Okay, so with that, we then move on to the next chapter where we discuss the distribution of surplus value. So in chapter 3 and 4, we understood the generation, realization of surplus value. And then in chapter 5, we take up the argument of volume 3, where Marx explains how this surplus value, which has been generated and realized, is then distributed and redistributed through various mechanisms and ends up as the income stream of important fractions of the ruling class or the non-working class. So this argument moves in two steps. First, there is a discussion about the mobility of capital. The uniform rate of profit emerges through the mobility of capital, and a set of prices emerge which supports this average rate of or uniform rate of profit. So that is the first step in the distribution. After that, part of that surplus value then further gets divided into income stream as interest. So that goes to money capitalists, and a part of the surplus value is appropriated by owners of non-reproducible resources like land. That is what Marx calls rent. So at the end of this chapter, we really go through the full argument, and we understand how surplus value is generated, how it is realized, and how it is then redistributed in society to emerge as the income stream of important non-working class fractions. So at the end of these three chapters, we reiterate some of the important conclusions that Marx tried to convey through these three volumes. One, the incomes of all non-working class people are of a form of surplus value. So whether it is profit or interest or rent, all of it is surplus value. Surplus value itself is the unpaid labor of the working people, the direct producers. And therefore, capitalism, like all other class divided societies, rests on the appropriation of a part of the labor of the people who directly work. And that is why it is an exploitative system. And finally, as we read through the three volumes, we get a sense of the profound ambiguity of capitalism. On the one hand, it is technologically progressive. It opens up immense possibilities of improving the well-being of people. But then, because of the logic of profit and accumulation, all those possibilities are not realized. And therefore, we kind of agree with Marx that the best way to realize the possibilities opened up by capitalism is to transcend it and replace it with a more humane and just system. So we then move on to the next part of the book, where I take up three important issues that has been a matter of great debate, discussion, and controversy in Marxist economics. First, in chapter 6, I talk about technical change and profitability. So here, the discussion is about an important claim that Marx made in volume 3, which is that the uniform rate of profit in capitalist societies will have a tendency to fall over time. Marx had an argument which was not watertight, which had not been completely worked. But in the 1960s, a Japanese economist came up with an argument which kind of completely countered Marx's claim. So Nobuo Okishio tried to show that actually if capitalists behave in a profit maximizing manner, then the general rate of profit will have a tendency to rise rather than to fall. So here you had two kind of contradictory claims. Now the main thing discussed in this chapter is to present a framework which is not novel, which is known, to show that if you allow for technical change, capitalist behavior, profit maximizing behavior, and you allow effects of the labor market to kick in, then we can develop a more general framework where, because of technical change and changes in the labor market, the rate of profit might fall or it might rise. So it is neither conclusion is correct, Marx nor Okishio, but both can be true. So depending on certain parameters of the model, the rate of profit might fall or it might rise. And the important thing is, after technical change has taken place, how much does the real wage rate rise? So Okishio's completely rests on assuming that the real wage rate is fixed. If the real wage is allowed to change, we can see that if the real wage rate changes by a large amount, the rate of profit will fall. If it does not change, then the rate of profit will rise. So the chapter kind of concludes by saying that there is no contradiction between Marx and Ocasio, but we can have a more general framework where both claims can be special cases. The next chapter talks about, again, an issue which has been a matter of great debate and discussion and controversy, which is the relationship of values, which is the socially necessary abstract labor time required to produce a commodity, and the price, the amount of money that is needed to purchase 1 unit of the commodity. Now, in volume 3 of Capital, Marx had tried to explain what the relationship between the two is. And it is a quantitative argument because Marx wanted to show what is the quantitative relationship between prices and value. And Marx made some errors which can be easily corrected. And once we correct those errors, we have a well worked out framework where we can see the relationship of prices and value. Now, this framework, which emerged through the work of Portkovis and then was later formalized by scholars like Morishima, Ocasio, Seaton. This framework was the dominant framework till about the 60s. In the late 60s and early 70s, scholars borrowing from the work of Sraffa, especially Ian Steedman, launched a very strong critique of this standard interpretation. And the main point was that the concept of value is really redundant. Because if you have given to you information about technology, about the real wage, then you can calculate the prices of production. Now, the question of what is the relationship of prices and values is not important for the Sraffian scholar. They want to say that we want to calculate prices and we can do so without any reference to the concept of value. And moreover, they claim that all important phenomena in capitalism can be understood without any reference to value. So the controversy and debate about the transformation problem is really about these two questions. One, can you correct Marx's error and calculate prices in a consistent manner? And the answer is yes. The standard interpretation should. The second, more important question is, if you do calculate those prices, can you then also show that value, the concept of value is not theoretically redundant? And I present an interpretation of one way of understanding this question, which was developed independently in the late 70s by Gerard Dumenil, a French Marxist scholar, and Duncan Foley, an American Marxist scholar, which I think allows us to answer both questions. And this chapter is really a long and standalone chapter where I present this interpretation, which is able to rebut the Sraffian critique, I think, in a convincing manner. Finally, the last chapter talks about the important issue of exploitation and oppression. So we had already seen that capitalism is an exploitative system. We go back to that issue and explore it in greater detail in this chapter. And I look at the qualitative issues related to exploitation, then look at a literature which has tried to quantify exploitation. Then I look at a critique of Marxist analysis, since Marxist analysis keeps labor at the center of exploitation. There is a literature which says that that is not correct, and I present a critique of that claim. And then I look at recent work which has tried to argue for manifold exploitations, to displace class exploitation and put it at par with all other kinds of oppressions, and there, in a way, remove the concept of exploitation and replace it with oppression. And I kind of present a critique of that. So that's where the book ends. I will now quickly move on. How am I doing on time? Do I have a few more minutes? Devarshi, do
Yeah,
I have a few
Dipankar.
more?
Yeah.
Huh.
Please go on.
Okay, I'll take a few more minutes. I want to present three kind of novel arguments that I make at some points in the book just to draw attention of the readers. So one issue that is there hidden in the value theory of Marx is how to conceptualize the intensification of work. And the intensification of work is important for various reasons. One, it has an implication on how we understand the rate of surplus value or the rate of exploitation and what form it takes. There is also a lot of literature which has pointed out that over the last 3-4 decades, intensification of work has happened. So there is also an important aspect to relate to current capitalism. And I present a simple way to conceptualize intensification of labor by pointing out that it has two important aspects. One, when there is intensification of work, it means that workers are able to convert more inputs into outputs in a given period of time. So that is what I say, use value handling capacity of labor rises. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that since labor is working more intensively in any period of time, adds more value. On the one hand, it becomes more productive. On the other, it adds more value. If we take these two aspects and then work out the implications, we get a nice and transparent way of understanding the role of intensification of labor in value. So this is one novel argument. I will come back to it if there are questions later. So in the interest of time, the second novel argument relates to a long discussion about Marx's theory of rent. And here I extend some work that Debarshi did. I think he was the first to consistently work out how to decompose total rent into the three components that Marx had claimed it can be divided into. So Marx's argument was that rent is really a part of surplus value. And we have already seen that argument in chapter 5. What he also claimed is that total ground rent is really composed of three parts. One part which can be associated with fertility or locational advantages of a plot of land vis-a-vis others. And that part he called differential rent of variety 1. The second part relates to the differences in the investment that has taken place on different plots of land. And that part he called differential rent of variety 2. And after you take out these two, a part remains, which he calls absolute rent. Now, in the discussion in Marxist economics, there has been a lot of confusion about what is absolute rent. Some people think it is related to the monopoly power of land use. Some people think that it is related to the low organic composition of capital in agriculture. Now, Debarshi, in a recent paper, quantitatively showed how total ground rent can be very nicely broken up into these three parts. And the important conclusion from that was that absolute rent really rests on a difference between the least productive investment across all plots of land and the opportunity cost of investing in agriculture. So if you invest in agriculture, you are not getting the rate of return in the rest of the economy, and that's what I call the opportunity cost. As long as there is a difference between the least productive unit of investment in agriculture and this opportunity cost, you can have absolute rent. Now, one step ahead to take this argument ahead is to think about the capitalist farmers. What do they do? How do they decide how much to invest? And if you think about that, it seems that if they want to maximize their profit, then they will choose a level of investment where the least productive investment will actually be equal to the opportunity cost. And therefore, there will be no absolute rent. So this is a way to intervene in this long and confusing discussion about rent and to point out that unless there is a very valid mechanism which keeps the least productive investment and the opportunity cost of capital, there is a wedge between them, then there can be no absolute risk. And finally, I want to briefly talk about an argument about a critique of Marx. So there is a analytical Marxist argument that there is nothing special in labor. The fact that Marx chose labor to become the substance of value and then to put it at the center of the theory of exploitation cannot be justified, because any other commodity which is directly or indirectly used to produce every other commodity, which is what they call a basic commodity. If there is a commodity like that, then we can construct a value theory based on that. And then we can say that that commodity is exploited just like labor is. So this is an influential argument and has led many people to be convinced that there is nothing special in labor. So let's just give up the labor theory of value. And I point out that this is an argument which rests on two simple errors. One, an inability to distinguish labor from labor power. So remember, labor power is the commodity that is sold in the market. It is the capacity to do useful work. When that capacity is used, you get labor. So conceptually, the two are different. This argument forgets this conceptual difference. The second, it does not distinguish between labor power, which is a unique commodity, and all other commodities. Labor power is a unique commodity. Because it is a ability that inheres in the person of the worker. It is unlike every other commodity. And once we think of these two important differences, then labor is, in my mind, restored as the substance of value and at the center of a theory of exploitation. So I will stop there and hope to answer any questions or comments that arise.
Thank you, Dipankar. So lots of food for thought. I hope many people will have many questions regarding those thoughts that Dipankar just articulated. Now we come to the panelists. Initially, we thought that we'll go alphabetically, but Professor Achin Vinayak is having some problem with the video. So you cannot see him and he will not be able to see us, but we can hear him at least, and he will be able to hear us. So let us go with Achin Vinayak first. I mean, we are going in a reverse alphabetical manner. Maybe Professor Vinayak can talk first, then we'll come to Professor Michael, and finally Amit will be the last speaker from the panelists.
Thank you, Devarshi. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, let me start. This book, in two parts, is, in my view, actually meant for three audiences. The first part is for those seeking to understand Marx's basic anatomical dissection of the capitalist mode of production, namely the manner in which surplus value, which is hidden behind exchange relations, is produced, realized, distributed, and accumulated. Dipankar has, of course, stressed this already. The second part, in my view, actually goes in two directions. On the one hand, it is for other Marxist scholars who have sought in different ways to strengthen the application of the labor theory of value to uncover the workings of the capitalist political economy. Here, Dipankar evaluates the strengths and weaknesses of these respective approaches before identifying his own preferred approach and justifying its greater merit. The other direction, on the other hand, he seeks to counter those neoclassical economists and others, not neoclassical, but others, who reject the labor theory of value as incoherent or unnecessary. And such is the quality of his expositions that one would love to see how all these scholars might respond to this text. In short, this is a remarkable work, for I cannot think of any other single text of a similar kind that is as comprehensive and systematic in both faithful exposition and in its critique of the different approaches. Now, before going on to the deeper study of Marx's 3 volumes in part 1, the author provides a brief exegesis on dialectics and on historical materialism, where to me he seems to assign causal primacy to the relations of production over productive power, productive forces. Class struggle is seen as the mechanism that brings about large-scale changes in social structures. But the author insists that this change must be explained by what happens to the contradiction between the relations and forces of production. So here is the first of a number of questions that I want to put forward to the debunker. First, where do you stand in respect of the Brenner thesis that emphasizes the historical contingency of capitalism's emergence and relates this to the very distinctive balance of class forces in the England of the 16th century between the monarchy, nobility, and the free peasantry? One question here. Other questions later. In part 1's remaining chapters, one is struck by the scrupulousness with which key concepts such as the circuit of capital, labor, labor power, surplus values, abstract character, skill complexity, socially wasted and necessary character of labor, and the changes in labor process from its formal to real subsumption, and of course the whole issue of absolute and relative surplus value. All of these are dissected and their relationship very carefully explained. A lot of algebra is used, but even if the reader finds this difficult to follow, like I did, she can skip this and simply rely on the clarity with which matters are explained in ordinary language. Debunker affirms his commitment to the use of a conversion factor. This is the ratio called the monetary expression of value, or MEV, that can quantitatively connect value and money measurements. He also breaks from an older, almost sacrosanct Marxist tradition in upholding what is called the new interpretation that does not define the value of labor power in terms of the wage commodity bundle, but in terms of the wage share in national income. And this wage share can, of course, go up and down through class struggle. The author recognizes the interplay between the processes of generating absolute and relative surplus value, and also between formal and real subsumption, the interplay between these. Marx saw the latter term, that is to say, relative surplus value, and the latter term, real subsumption, in each case, in each duo, expanding at the expense of the former. There would be a movement from formal to more and more real subsumption, and there'd be a movement from absolute to relative surplus. Yet many today would say that the unavoidable dynamic of capitalism that sustains this interplay most everywhere, and which was not recognized by Marx, is the uneven and combined character of all capitalist development. So my second question to the debunker is, how would you respond to this claim? Remember, Marx in the Communist Manifesto talks about the advanced countries showing the mirror to the future of the development of the backward countries, when in fact one can argue that everywhere there is an uneven and combined character of capitalist development. Again, though debunker refers in passing to the impact of technical change on nature, and this is my third question, although you refer to the impact of technical change on nature and its deleterious effects, could you elaborate a bit more on this? Jason Moore, for example, talks about how continuing ecological devastation raises the cost of 4 key inputs: labor, energy, food, raw materials, thereby ensuring a growing crisis of capital accumulation. But there are other Marxists who say that expanded weak production can take place despite ecological devastation, and indeed from this very ecological degradation. So, what is your thinking, debunker, on this issue of capitalism and the environment? I will skip over the later chapters where the author handles questions concerning A, whether Marx's law of the tendency of the profit rate to fall is correct or not. Apparently, it all depends on how the real wage rate behaves. And then, of course, the second one about resolving what has been called the transformation problem. And here, Dipankar defends Marx's labor theory of value, as he has pointed out, wherein the principle of worker exploitation explains the origin of profit, which can also be quantitatively measured. And this emphasis on exploitation segues into the last chapter where he discusses class exploitation and distinguishes class exploitation from other forms of oppression. This, in my view, is an accurate and very courageous stand on the left today, when there is much talk of intersectionality and also of capital as but one vector. Why do you go on and on about capitalism? It is one vector, admittedly power, among a host of other vectors of oppression or distributive injustice. So you have a common discourse these days when it comes to racial, gender, ethnic injustices, and this is something you must understand clearly. We struggle for equality across these divisional markers. Equality cultural in terms of greater dignity and respect, as well as in undoing material disadvantages. But race and gender are in themselves not analytical categories like class, which in the Marxist, but not in the Weberian definition, is axiomatically a relational category of exploitation. Of classes, we do not struggle for equality across classes, but want its disappearance. That is to say, a classless society. We do not fight or want to fight for a raceless or genderless society, only that this difference not be connected to unjust distribution of respect or of material benefits. Furthermore, the relationship between, for example, class and women's oppression, in my view, is asymmetric, though both injustices and both processes can. Class, however, is more central to the functioning of capitalism, which is also more flexible in its capacity to address other oppressions. A small example. In the 1960s and 70s, we said that since women's oppression is historically longer standing and more universal, in fact, women's oppression precedes class societies and exists within as well as between classes. So we used to say in the 1960s and 70s, so a decline in inequalities of income and wealth between men and women would necessarily lead or very strongly lead to a decline in economic inequalities between classes. Decades later, many countries have promoted women's rights, while less economic inequality of gender within classes has been accompanied by much steeper economic and power inequalities between classes. So I end by really saying that we must fight on all fronts. But if we want to get rid of capitalism, then the most necessary, but still insufficient condition for doing this and for achieving fuller emancipation is, of course, the fight against capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Van Eyck. Dipankar, you want to respond after all the three deliberations or right now?
Yeah, I'm noting down. I will respond at the end.
Okay. Okay, now I hand it over to Professor Tom Michael.
Thank you, Debarshi, and thank you for inviting me to this this panel. I have some comments that I've written down, but they're not nearly as polished as Professor Van Eyck's excellent and thought-provoking comments. I want to start by just, thinking back to when I started, getting interested in Marxian economics. And it was actually very difficult back, this was in the 70s. There was really only one text that had been written, and that was Paul Sweezy's Theory of Capitalist Development. And even that was a fairly difficult text. And, the 3 volumes of Capital is very difficult to wade through if you're an undergraduate. So one of the audiences of this text, it seems to me, is students who are, want to learn the basics of Marxian political economy. And this is a terrific text because it is self-contained. Previous texts, for example, Duncan Foley's excellent book written in the 80s, is really designed to be used with reading at least the first volume of Capital and probably sections of volumes 2 and 3. But Dipankar has written a text which is basically self-contained, which I think is terrific. If you want to teach this material, which I have been doing now for 15 or 20 years, this is an important resource. The other audience is, I think, graduate students and economists and intellectuals who want to be well educated about modern economics. And I think they need, even if you're not committed to Marxian political economy, you should, as part of a reasonably comprehensive education, you need to have some exposure to this material. Years ago, I was at a conference, and a prominent neoclassical economist was asked a question. It was a session on inequality, and somebody asked him something probably about the surplus value, and his response was to basically say, well, the labor theory of value has basically been disproved, and he stated that as if it were an established fact, when in fact, over the last 20 years or 30 years, there's really been tremendous development, and we have a much deeper understanding of the theoretical aspects, as Dipankar explained, with the new interpretation, and also empirical aspects of the labor theory of value. So if I could talk to that prominent economist, I would tell him, read Dipankar's book, because it will give you a serious introduction. And one of the things that's important here, I think, both for students and also for people who want to engage with Marxian political economy, is that Dipankar explains the methodology of Marx. There's this famous passage in the Grundrisse, which is kind of obscure, but the basic point is that both the investigation and exposition of our understanding of capital has to pay attention to the level of abstraction of the argument. And Dipankar did a very good job of explaining the progression from volume 1 to volume 3 in capital. But this is an important point, because if you really want to understand the defense of the labor theory, you really need to understand this idea that Marx is starting out in volume 1 with the level of production. So he's considering a sort of representative unit of capital, and it's natural to apply the labor theory in a fairly straightforward way at that point. But then, as you get closer and closer to reality, as you ascend to or descend to more and more concrete levels of abstraction, you bring in other determinations, like the equalization of the profit rate, which creates this transformation problem that Dipankar explained. But it doesn't stop there, and this is, I think, something that the neo-Serafians fail to really appreciate. The labor theory, goes on, and it looks at more concrete expressions of value, and the redistribution of surplus value is a kind of the linchpin in understanding how you get to more concrete levels. The theory of rent, for example, the theory of productive and unproductive labor, the theory of interest and money capital, and so forth. So I think it's important to see the labor theory as having some validity, not just because it can be defended through the new interpretation, but because it really is providing us with an insight into what the most fundamental determinants of value are, and what the price system is doing. It's organizing society around the production of surplus value, and it provides us with a theory of surplus value, which is something that neoclassical economics has eluded. Neoclassical economics coming up with a convincing theory of profit. In fact, this has long been known that they actually have their own transformation problem. It was called the Cambridge Capital Controversy, and it basically knocked the legs out from under the so-called marginal productivity theory that dominates modern macroeconomics. So once again, I think that the issues Dipankar has raised are, I would love to see the responses with to some of the arguments that he's put forward from, conventional neoclassical economists, as well as perhaps Serafians and others who are more sympathetic to the Marxian economic project. So let me just mention a couple of highlights in the book. If you're thinking of using it to teach Marxian political economy, one is the treatment of expanded reproduction and simple reproduction, the so-called schemes of reproduction. Duncan Foley's book provides a fairly difficult mathematical exposition, but Dipankar has managed to come up with a much more approachable algebraic treatment. As he mentioned, his treatment of rent is original, and it's, I think, convincing explanation of rent. His coverage of the Occhio theorem is extremely clear. And finally, his treatment of the new interpretation and debates about the labor theory of value and the transformation problem is, I think, is admirably clear. So if you're interested in using this book or, teaching out of the book, those are some of the highlights. I want to end with a couple of questions, which I think are much more, well, they're quite general questions. One is coming from the new interpretation. The basic idea of the new interpretation is that money expresses value. So you need to have a theory of money in order to understand the relationship between the prices we observe and the socially necessary labor time that is the basis for labor values. So the basic equation that holds this all together is the idea that the value of labor power is equal to the value of money times the money wage. And in this interpretation, the value of labor power can be, at some level of abstraction, interpreted as the wage share in value added. Dipankar actually points out that this is incomplete, this new interpretation, because we need to have a theory of what determines the value of money and what determines the money wage. Now, in Marx, the gold standard prevailed, and determining the value of money was a question of applying the labor theory of value consistently to the money commodity. But of course, the gold standard fell apart, and we now have what is usually called a fiat money system, in which money is created by the state. My take on this is that Dipankar is right, and that this is, in fact, a central question for Marxian political economy. But I think that to answer it, we're going to have to engage seriously in understanding the role of central banks and the state in regulating, first, the value of money, which is what central banks are really in the business of doing. They're in the business of managing the inflation process. And second, the distribution of income. And I think this is probably going to involve some kind of synthesis or reconceptualization using tools and ideas drawn from Keynesian and Kaleckian political economy. So my view of the way forward is some kind of synthesis of Keynesian economics. I want to go back to the point about methodology, because in that passage, that famous Grundrisse passage, Marx actually says that the method of political economy is a method of critiquing existing conceptualizations so that you can kind of reconceptualize the problem. And I would maintain, and I'd like to hear if Dipankar thinks this is perhaps correct, I would suggest that that is in fact a central challenge for Marxian political economy. Second point I'd like to bring up is applying Marxian theory to understanding the current crises of capitalism and the nature of modern neoliberal capitalism. I think that is very much an unfinished project. And here, I think the rate of profit is, I have questions about the role of profitability. Many of us think that modern neoliberal capitalism suffers from not too low a rate of profit, but in a sense, a profit rate which is potentially too high, and that its contradictions are based on that imbalance. But I'm not sure whether that's true or not. And I think that there's research to be done on technical change, the rate of profit, and its role in shaping the laws of motion of modern capitalism. So and I've actually been a part of the. We wrote this book, Growth and Distribution, that I think Debashis mentioned, and we created the idea that there was evidence for the falling rate of profit, but it looks like advanced capitalism does not have some kind of a clear historical trend. Dipakar has created a website with data from the Penn World Tables, which seems to suggest actually that what we said in Growth and Distribution is perhaps not accurate, and that in fact there's considerable evidence that the profit rate on a global scale has been falling. So I think that there is work to be done on this broad issue of technical change, the falling rate of profit, and its role in shaping modern capitalism. So I'll stop there with those couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Michael. And let me now go to the next panelist, Amit. Over to you.
Thanks, Debashis. I'll keep it brief because I think people will have questions from the audience, and I also am keen to hear Dipankar's responses to the excellent questions raised already by the other two panelists. I'll just first of all join the other two panelists in congratulating Dipankar on a fantastic book. I mean, I'm just thoroughly enjoying the book. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to really read it as carefully as it requires. It's not an easy book to understand because, as anyone can imagine, it's not easy to distill all of that stuff in one. When I read the introduction, I saw him say that volume 1 is in this chapter and volume 2 is in the other chapter. I was a little bit. I was really surprised. But when I read it, it's amazing. I mean, I can't believe that a volume is in one chapter and you can actually read it and get a sense of the logic of that volume. It's just phenomenal. So there are probably people here who haven't yet looked at it and so forth in the audience. So I really encourage you to look at it, particularly if you're a student, you're interested in Marxian political economy. As Professor Michael said, I haven't seen anything like this. Certainly not in recent years. And even earlier books, are not in the same way self-contained, as Professor Michael also said. So the combination of the exposition of the 3 volumes and the second part, which is the debates, and here's where we see Dipankar's consistent engagement over the many years in being in the thick of these debates, and these are not fools don't should not go into these debates, right? They are phenomenally complex with a lot of literature and so forth. And again, he has done a wonderful job of writing about things like the transformation problem, which a person like me just doesn't want to open that box, right? And I'm not obviously as much of a Marxist scholar, certainly not a scholar, and as much as perhaps a Marxist to really have engaged in these debates profoundly. But I found this book to be wonderful. to give me an introduction, and not only an introduction, but also a resolution to so many of these long-standing puzzles, including the transformation problem, but also the analytical Marxist critique and so forth. So, I'm just really in awe of this book. Um, uh, uh, as well, I should point out something that hasn't been, I think, pointed out yet. There is R-code in it for people who want to, duplicate some of these things. So, a kind of nice way to bring in more modern readers who are data oriented, who would like to, do the kind of empirical Marxism that Dipankar again has been, doing so wonderfully over the last few years. So I think the website probably has the data and the code. Dipankar, I think, did not show it, but maybe he can, if there's time, possibly even share the screen and show it. It's a nice resource which collects the data as well as the code for you to be able to do the things that he's doing. So yeah, so all of that is just by way of just praise and admiration. A few straight thoughts, and these are going to be very niche because again I'm reading it from a very different context and perspective, and last few years I haven't thought about many of these things. So Dipankar, just a few nice things that occurred to me that I found interesting. Perhaps you may too. Number one, in the appendix to chapter 3, where you talk about simple and complex labor, and I've always been interested in this possibilities that open up when one considers labor power to be a commodity, and particularly when one brings in the issues of skilling, education, and apprenticeship in it. As you know, this is one of my long-standing interests. And when I was reading this, again, I was thinking back to, well, how can we think about the production of skilled labor in a surplus labor economy, where the value of the uh, people who are producing this labor power, the people that you refer to whose time goes in apprenticeship and so forth, are themselves also part of the surplus economy. So there's an interesting thing here to think about, I think. And why it is interesting from the capital laws of motion perspective is because, as you and I know, this part of the surplus economy is integrated into the capitalist economy through terms of trade. There's through outsourcing and so forth, there's trade happening between the capitalist economy and the non-capitalist economy, and the non-capitalist economy is producing this skilled labor through a very different kind of process than what would occur in a capitalist economy. So that was something that just I hadn't thought about it in a while, and it occurred to me while reading this. The second point also goes back to the surplus labor issue, and this is a stray, again, not, it's almost a passing thing that you say in the volume 2 chapter on the problem of aggregate demand, and where you point out that in a surplus labor context, expansion of credit can give you expansion of the capitalist economy. And what this reminded me of was the same point actually made by Lewis in his original paper, the Unlimited Labor Supplies paper, which has a lot of stuff in it that is just sort of sitting there, which people don't talk about too much. But there's a long section on credit and how expansion of credit in poor countries can achieve structural transformation in the presence of surplus labor. Of course, Lewis is assuming away any problem of aggregate demand. For him, savings equal investment and so forth. So there's something to think about there, which brings me to the second point, which is immediately after this point about credit, you talk about how there's a footnote there which talks about we are really deferring the problem to determinants of investment when we talk about this, and you don't go there. I'm assuming what you are referring to there is a kind of post-Keynesian approach to thinking about where, how to think about investment, or maybe not. You don't say that explicitly, so I'm curious, is that what you're thinking about? And then finally, the last bit is on the labor power distinction. Again, a very nice part in the second part of the book. Now here, this is maybe there in the book, which I just haven't had time to read, but I was hoping you could clarify. Uh, so the important conceptual breakthrough here for Marx, and which you emphasize, is that labor and labor power are two different things. Now, the value that is embodied in the worker and the value produced by the worker therefore are two different things. Whether one is greater, equal to, or lesser than the other is really dependent on a whole other set of concerns, which is the management of the labor process. Right? And the challenge of the capitalist is to extract more value from the worker than is embodied in the worker in the form of the wage. So there, uh, uh, well, what I'm saying is, isn't it necessary to bring in the legal or juridical dimension of ownership of property and the ownership of means of production, which is really what sets up the whole context for the extraction of more labor than is embodied in the production of the worker himself or herself. Because if that did not exist, then the conceptual distinction remains, but it no longer has that it no longer has a relevance, because workers will themselves decide on producing whatever it is. They may produce a surplus, they may not produce a surplus, and so forth. And that's not that. It's important in terms of the growth of perhaps a socialist economy, but it's not relevant anymore from the exploitation context. So without that juridical element and without that element of property ownership, are we really home yet? And again, this might be there, but I just thought I'd raise it. So sorry, I took more than I thought I was going to take. I'm done.
Thank you, Amit. Those were quite probing questions, especially for from the developing countries' point of view, I guess. Um, yeah, Dipankar, over to you if you want to respond to the comments.
Yeah, so these are excellent questions, and I do not think I'll be able to do justice to most of them. They require much more time and engagement. But let me quickly respond to a couple of them. So let me start with Achin's questions. On the ecological question, I have not really thought a lot about it. I mean, I have a broad sense, but I am not yet equipped to provide a it using more conventional language. To me, that is the key question. Now, what a Marxist analysis can add to this is not yet clear to me, so I will leave it at that. The question about absolute and relative surplus value, I think, is very important, and the combined and uneven nature of capitalism, I think, is very important. And I think here the simple model of intensification of labor that I present goes some way in answering this question, and I think it is important. So it has been typically understood, and probably a reading of Marx led to the understanding that production of absolute surplus value is present only in the initial stages of capitalism, and as capitalism develops, there is a transition from using absolute to relative surplus value production to increase the rate of surplus value. I think that is not correct, because even when relative surplus value production happens, technological change happens, capitalists have the ability to increase the rate of surplus value by increasing the intensity of labor. Now, for a long time, it was not clear whether intensification of labor produces absolute surplus value or relative surplus value. And I think the model I present clarifies that issue. And it is clear in my mind that intensification of labor produces absolute surplus value, which means that the two actually coexist even in advanced capitalism, and therefore the uneven and combined nature of development is there in advanced capitalism as much as it is there in capitalism which is developing in the periphery. So I kind of agree that we cannot separate it out clearly and say one is in the initial stage, one in the later stage. They go together. An important political implication is that just like in mid-19th century England or in Europe or in early stages of capitalist development, the working classes struggle for minimizing the day length of the working day was important. I think an important part of working class struggle today is going to be to try to have a limit on the intensification of labor. But it is also more difficult because where we can define the length of the working day clearly as 8 hours or 6 hours, intensification of labor is difficult to define. And the capitalist always has available technologies of surveillance, managerial labor to kind of increase intensification. So I think this is an important point. And I think that the way to go ahead is to use some variant of the framework I provided. Now, the question about the contingency of development of capitalism, I do not really have a, a way to say whether uh, there is a natural progression in history where capitalism is going to come after feudalism. It seems to me that every historical case will have to be analyzed concretely, and in that I think Brenner did an excellent job to analyze the class forces and their balance and how that led to the development of capitalism. So I wouldn't say that there is any kind of uh, a natural progression. But I would also temper that by saying that uh, in the historical materialist understanding, there is a natural progression of the development of productive forces. And there is an important element added to that, which is that no mode of production is infinitely flexible. So there is bound to come a point where the productive forces are no longer able to develop within the confines of a given mode of production. So at that point, a crisis emerges. Now, whether the crisis will lead a new mode of production or not depends on the balance of class forces. But the fact that a crisis will emerge is what historical materialist understanding says. So, where I agree with Brenner, I would also try to say that there is a kind of a progression in history in terms of the development of productive forces, which he underplays, and I would like to bring that also into the picture. To go to Tom's questions, I mean, these are excellent and big questions. I do not really have much to say about them, though I agree. So the first thing that he says is a synthesis of insights from Marx and Keynes will be essential as we try to work out a theory of the value of money, which on the one hand will need us to look carefully about the central bank, and on the other, the forces that lead to the distribution of income between the fundamental classes. And here, a synthesis is certainly necessary. I think I completely agree. The question about the falling rate of profit and technical change is also very interesting. Now, here there are, there are a couple of things that I would like to just add to what Tom said. And broadly, I'm in agreement with him. When the current crisis started, I was also looking at the rate of profit to make sense of the crisis, because that's how we had understood the crisis of the 60s. And Gerard Dumenil made a very solid argument that this crisis was not preceded by a long period of decline in the average rate of profit. So this seemed to be different. And I completely agree. So when we looked at the evidence for that for the US economy, Rama and I looked at that carefully, and we saw that it is different from the 60s. So that led me to try to understand crisis from the perspective of generation of surplus value. And then when I went back to Sweezy and Foley's book, I see that there are actually a typology of crisis which looks, which thinks of crisis emerging in both situations. One, when the system produces inadequate amount of surplus value, which leads to a decline in the rate of profit, but also a crisis when the system produces excess surplus value, and that gets manifested in problems in the financial system and others. So I then start thinking of crisis with these two typology, and the neoliberal kind of crisis is a crisis of excess surplus value. I think that gives me a way to think about it. But then when I step back and look at a longer run trend about the rate of profit, it is more kind of puzzling to me. On the one hand, I think that Marx's argument about the rate of profit declining was not watertight. So there, on by itself, technical change and capitalist behavior will not give rise to a rate of profit declining. And there, Ocasio is correct. We have to bring the labor market in. So that argument is kind of correct, that the labor market and the rate of the wage rate move, how it changes is important. But then I did some econometric work on long run profit rates, and there I find evidence that it has declined. And secondly, when I calculated along with some authors a global rate of profit from the 60s till now, aggregating rate of profit across a large range of capitalist countries, again, we see that it has declined. So it's kind of open question how to explain that. Is it the case that the wage rate has always moved in a way to make the rate of profit fall or not? I think this is an open question for research. Then coming to Amit's question, I think these are again excellent questions. I have not I did not have a lot of time to engage with that, the aspect of the labor surplus economy and how that impacts in this book, but I hope to do so in the future. Now, the question about the production of skilled labor is important, and I was hoping to kind of stop by pointing out some open questions for research, in which one of them is how a Marxist framework can explain the differential of wages or the differential of income between different classes of working people. So one way to do that is to understand the cost of producing that skilled labor, but it is not yet fully worked out. I think that's an open question. And even though I give a little bit of a little framework on this in the appendix, I think that needs to be worked out further, especially in a labor surplus context where those who are producing are themselves getting underpaid because of the labor surplus. So how that occurs, I think is important. So let me briefly comment on this question of the value of labor power and the value created by labor power. So my understanding is that there is both a technological aspect and a legal juridical aspect. So the technological aspect is that so let's step back from capitalism and think of a class divided society. Class divided society rests on exploitation in the sense that one group appropriates part of the labor of another group. Now, for that to be possible, it has to be preceded by a long period of historical development where technological change has made it possible so that a group can produce what it needs by working only a part of the working day. So it is only then that the working day can be divided into necessary and surplus labor. So that is the technological aspect. But then how it is done in an actual class divided society, whether it is feudalism or slave society or capitalism, brings in the specific juridical element of that mode of production. So in feudalism, it is much more openly non-economic and coercive. In capitalism, that is hidden behind the labor market, and certainly on the shop floor, the extraction of labor from labor power through the mechanisms of surveillance and managerialism and etc. are important. So I think both have a role to play. So I will stop with that and see if there are other questions or comments from participants.
Thank you, Dipankar. Yeah, it was a quite comprehensive sort of responses. Um, I think we should give some chance to the audience if they want to ask any questions. If there are, if we have some time after this, then the panelists, if they want to respond to Dipankar's response, they can go. Okay, let me now invite questions, comments from the audience. If people are watching on the YouTube, then they can type their questions on the YouTube channel chat box. I can relay those questions here.
So as we wait, I will share my screen and briefly show you the companion website, which Amit mentioned. So this is the companion website. I will share my slides where the URL is there. So in this, there is a errata. I already found there are a lot of typological errors. I was reading it. So that you can find here, that should clarify any questions. Then there are the data sets that I have used for various pictures and charts. The R code is printed on the appendix itself, so I didn't put it here, but maybe I should go back and put it. So you can go there, and then there is these two websites we have created on profitability. One is the world profitability that Tom mentioned, and then there is a more detailed profitability on US. These dashboards give you charts to download the whole data set, everything. So that should be useful to people who research profitability.
So I have got the book with me. So this is the book we're talking about, right? It's quite fitting that we should show at least the book that we're talking about here. This is the commodity. Okay. Soham Pradhan has some questions. Soham, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Soham, are you there? Or if you are not able to speak, you can type your question on the chat box. Let me check whether he's there or not.
Yeah, he typed his question. So let me read out the question. How does one situate the question of class amid growing debates on intersectionality? Yeah, this is a very important question, and Achin talked about this. So I present some a way to understand this question in the last chapter of the book, and the broad thing that I would highlight is that class is related to exploitation in a strict analytical manner that we define here, where one group of people are able to appropriate a part of the labor of the other group. Now, this analytical aspect defines the notion of class, and this analytical aspect also shows us that there is a interdependence between these two groups, and also there is a contradiction of interest. So the broad Marxist project uh, is to remove this kind of relationship in societies, and that is what we mean by moving to a classless society. Now, in addition to this axis of exploitation, there are other ways in which one group of people oppress another group of people. And that oppression can be along the lines of social identities which are stable, like race, gender, ethnicity, citizenship, or it can be in the dimension of expropriation. So, for instance, when European settlers moved to the New World, they expropriated the indigenous people and took access to the land and other resources. But that relationship did not rest on appropriating the labor of the other. So it seems that in the context of in the current context when intersectionality has become important and scholars are using that concept, we must point out that while all forms of oppression are should be opposed and fought against, removing those oppressions will not change the basic class structure of capitalism. So even if all workers are treated equally and with respect, irrespective of race, the fact that there will be a class of workers and a class of capitalists, and the income of the working class will come from wage, and the income of the capitalist class will come from profits or surplus value, that will not change. So in addition to fighting against oppression, if we want to move to a classless society, then we have to bring back the concept of class into focus and inform our politics using that notion.
Okay, thank you, Dipankar. In the meanwhile, Amit has left because he has to attend to something at 8:30.
Okay.
Thank you, Amit, for joining us. Uh, and we have another question from another Amit, Amit Akash. Dipankar, can you attend that question?
Yes, I can see. Okay, so here's the question. Let me read. As you mentioned, combined and uneven development in today's context, how do you address global value chains and a Marxist reconstruction of value in so-called value chains? The production and distribution of surplus value in value chains and production networks. Yes, I think that's a great question. Uh, the so there are, I think, two important issues to think about here, and one one question that I briefly discuss in the book and partly in chapter 3 and the appendix is how do we compare the value created by 1 hour of labor in one country versus another country when they are at very different levels of capitalist development. So there is a tendency for some scholars to just equate 1 hour of labor in different countries. I think that is a mistake. We have to be a little more careful because the average worker is of a different complexity. So the complex labor power in different countries are different depending on capitalist development. That will have an implication on how we compare 1 hour of labor of workers in different countries. Now, what a global value chain does is to link up these two different uh, countries, and there is a method by which value transfers take place. So, while intuitively it is clear that value transfer is taking place from the periphery where production is taking place to the center where design and marketing takes place, while that much is clear, if we want to go further than that and quantifying that value transfer, we have to make sure that we calculate the values created by 1 hour of labor a little more in a little more nuanced manner by taking account of the complexity of labor across different countries. So I have not done any work beyond that, so I can just offer this broad comment at this point.
Uh, didn't you write a paper on this global supply chain and difference of between the labors of different countries, how to compare them?
Yes, I mean, Rama and I did a paper on that, but in that paper, we have avoided this issue. So we avoided the issue of how exactly to compare the labor, the value created by 1 hour of labor. We just looked at the value flow without taking account of the difference in complexity.
Okay. Amit Akash, you want to add something else? Your hand is raised. Oh no. Okay, so I don't think we have any further questions. So maybe we can wrap it up for the time being. Okay. If Achin or Tom want to respond to Dipankar's response, they can go ahead. Otherwise, we'll call it a day.
Well, I just want to thank the organizers and Dipankar for providing us with such a stimulating conversation. I have no other comments.
Thank you. Okay, then. So again, from the side of the department, Humanities and Social Sciences Department, IIT Guwahati, I thank you all the participants who had made to this meeting. For the US people, it's quite early in the morning, so for us it's not that difficult. And of course, all the parties, all the people who are there in the audience, they have been patient with us. There were some glitches, technical glitches, so they have showed us their indulgence. So I thank you all, and maybe we'll meet some other time for some other stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.